There is a specific kind of silence men keep around death, not peaceful silence, the kind that tightens in the chest at 3 in the morning when the house is quiet and the thoughts come in anyway. Most men will never say it out loud. They will say they are fine. They will say they have made peace with it. They will change the subject, pour another drink, turn on the game. And underneath all of that, something ancient and unacknowledged sits and waits. Baruch Spinoza, a philosopher so radical his own community excommunicated him, spent his entire life building a system of thought that, whether he intended it or not, reads like a direct answer to every fear men carry about death but never confess. This video is about those fears, all of them. The ones that hide behind ambition, behind silence, behind the obsessive need to be useful, to be remembered, to be in control. And it is about what Spinoza actually said, not the watered-down version, not the bumper sticker version, but the real, uncomfortable, surprisingly liberating version. So let us start where all of this actually starts. The fear nobody talks about here is something worth sitting with. Men, statistically, die by suicide at nearly 4 times the rate of women. They are less likely to seek mental health treatment. They are less likely to talk about existential fear with friends, partners, or therapists. They are more likely to describe themselves as not really afraid of death, even when their behavior says something completely different. The behavior is the tell. When a man works himself to exhaustion building something, a business, a body, a reputation, and cannot stop even when he wants to, that is not ambition in the simple sense. When a man cannot sit still, cannot be in silence, cannot let a weekend pass without productivity, something is running underneath the surface. When a man hears about a peer dying and immediately pivots to work the next morning rather than feeling anything, something is being managed. Death anxiety does not always look like fear. It looks like hyperactivity. It looks like legacy obsession. It looks like the refusal to talk about feelings because feelings remind you that you are soft, mortal, temporary. It looks like needing to dominate conversations, needing to win, needing to matter, because if you matter, then maybe the universe will notice before it erases you. The philosopher Irvin Yalom, who built an entire branch of therapy around existential fear, made the observation that unacknowledged death anxiety is probably one of the most powerful engines behind human behavior that we almost never name as such. We name it drive, we name it passion, we name it work ethic, we name it the refusal to be mediocre, and sometimes those things are exactly what they appear to be. But often, especially in men who were taught from boyhood that fear is weakness, those drives are fear wearing a productive costume. And here is the thing about fear in costume. It does not heal. It does not resolve. It just accumulates interest. The man who never examines his death terror does not become fearless. He becomes more rigid, more defended, more distant from everything that actually makes a life feel worth living. He becomes excellent at appearing fine and deeply alone in that excellence. Spinoza would have something very specific to say about this, and it would not be what most people expect from a philosopher. It would not be everything happens for a reason. It would not be death is not real. It would not be a comforting story about heaven or cosmic justice. Spinoza was brutally, almost offensively honest about the nature of existence. But within that honesty, within that refusal to comfort you with lies, there is something that actually works, something that has lasted more than 300 years precisely because it does not require you to believe anything false. But before we get there, we need to understand who Spinoza actually was and why his specific kind of mind is the one we need right now. The man who was excommunicated for thinking clearly, Baruch Spinoza was cast out of his own Jewish community in Amsterdam in 1656 with a curse so severe and so formal that historians still argue about exactly what he had done to deserve it. The excommunication document does not specify the offense. It just describes the abominable heresies and monstrous deeds of a young man who was, at the time, 23 years old. What Spinoza had done essentially was think without permission. He looked at the world and refused to accept the comfortable separations people had always relied on. The separation between God and nature, between mind and body, between human beings and the rest of existence. He said these separations are inventions. They make us feel special, and they make us feel safe, and they are not accurate. He said, God is not a person sitting outside the universe making decisions about it. God is the universe. God is nature itself, infinite and self-causing, operating according to its own laws with perfect necessity. There is no outside, there is no divine intervention. There is no cosmic plan written for you specifically. And then, having said all of that, having apparently removed every comforting scaffolding that religion typically provides, he built something remarkable on what remained. He built an entire ethics. An entire system for how to live well, how to think clearly, how to achieve what he called human freedom, which was not freedom from necessity, but freedom within it. The freedom that comes from understanding rather than from denial. His masterwork, the Ethics, was written in geometric form, propositions, proofs, corollaries, like a mathematical text applied to questions about God and human emotion and the good life. It is one of the strangest and most demanding books ever written. It is also, underneath all that formal structure, one of the most compassionate. Because what Spinoza understood, what he spent his whole life trying to articulate, is that human suffering, and specifically human fear, comes primarily from misunderstanding. We suffer because we do not understand what we are. We fear because we imagine ourselves to be something we are not. And when we understand, when we really understand, not just intellectually, but in the way that changes how you feel in the morning, the fear does not disappear exactly, but it transforms into something you can actually work with. Now, let us talk about the fears. Fear number 1, the fear of disappearing. The most fundamental fear, the one that sits underneath almost everything else, is simply this: I will stop existing. And that is unbearable to contemplate. Spinoza had a concept for this that he placed at the very center of his philosophy. He called it conatis. It comes from the Latin meaning effort, striving, impulse. And his claim was that every single thing that exists has, as its most basic defining characteristic, the drive to persist in its own being, not as a choice, not as a personality trait, as a metaphysical fact. A stone resists being destroyed. A plant grows toward light and finds water. An animal fights for survival. A human being does all of this and also writes books, builds empires, starts religions, falls in love, accumulates money, and constructs elaborate philosophical systems. But underneath all of it, at the root, is the same thing, the drive to keep existing. Conatis is not selfishness in the moral sense. It is not a flaw to be corrected. It is, for Spinoza, the very definition of what it means to be a thing. You are your conatus. Your persistence is you. And the stronger your conatus, the more powerfully you strive to exist, to expand your capacity to act and think and engage with the world, the more fully you exist. Now here is where this gets interesting, in relation to the fear of disappearing. The fear of disappearing, of ceasing to exist, is, from a Spinozist perspective, your conatus recognizing its own future negation. It is the drive to persist in countering the fact of mortality. And the way most men handle this is not by resolving the tension, but by escalating the conatus, by striving harder, building more, achieving more, becoming more visible, more powerful, more necessary to others. You see this in the way men approach legacy. The obsession with being remembered is not really about other people's memories. It is about the self trying to extend itself beyond the physical limit of the body. If people remember me, then something of me persists. If I build something that outlasts me, then I am not fully gone. The man who names a building after himself, the man who works 70 hours a week to build a company, the man who cannot stop optimizing and improving and expanding, these men are not necessarily greedy in the conventional sense. They are terrified, and they are using striving as an analgesic. Spinoza does not tell you that this is wrong exactly. The conatus is natural. Striving is natural. But he would ask you to look clearly at what you are actually doing when you strive compulsively, when striving becomes something you cannot turn off, when rest feels like death, when stopping feels like disappearing. Because here is the thing Spinoza understood about the fear of disappearing: it rests on a specific image of what you are. It assumes that you are this particular bounded self, this specific combination of name and face and memories and achievements, and that when this configuration ends, something precious and irreplaceable is annihilated. But Spinoza's metaphysics does not support that image. If God is nature, and you are part of nature, then you are a particular expression of something infinite. The specific configuration ends. The substance that constituted you does not. You are, in Spinoza's universe, a mode of infinite substance, a temporary but real expression of something that does not end. This is not the same as saying your soul lives forever. Spinoza was not making that claim. He was saying something subtler and in some ways stranger. The boundary you draw around yourself, the boundary you call me, is partially constructed. You are more continuous with everything around you than you normally feel. The thing you are afraid of losing may be less solid, less absolutely separate from everything else than the fear assumes. This does not make the fear go away instantly, but it begins to loosen the grip. Because the fear of disappearing is most powerful when you are completely identified with the bounded self. When you start to question the absoluteness of that boundary, the fear starts to change shape. Fear number 2, the fear that your life means nothing. There is a specific flavor of dread that hits men around middle age, or sometimes earlier, that does not feel like a fear of death exactly. It feels more like a question that arrives uninvited and refuses to leave. Is any of this actually mattering? Not in a philosophical way necessarily, not does human life have cosmic significance, but the more personal, more devastating version: does my life, specifically the one I am living right now, mean anything? The years I have spent working, the relationships I have maintained at a distance, the dreams I postponed, the version of myself I set aside because there was always something more practical to do, was any of that worth it? This is what philosophers call the meaning crisis, and while it affects everyone, it has a particular shape in men, because men are so often defined by what they produce. The man who builds his identity around his role, his job, his income, his usefulness to others, hits a specific wall when he asks whether that role constitutes a life, whether productivity is the same as meaning. Spinoza was a determinist. This is one of the most misunderstood things about him, and it is worth getting clear on because it is directly relevant here. Spinoza believed that everything that happens, every event, every decision, every thought, happens necessarily as a consequence of prior causes, all the way back through an infinite chain. There is no moment where you could have done otherwise. Free will, in the libertarian sense, the sense of being an uncaused cause, a self that stands outside the chain and chooses freely, Spinoza rejected entirely. Most people, when they first hear this, feel something like despair. If everything is determined, if I could not have done otherwise, then what is the point? What is the meaning in a world where nothing is genuinely my choice? But Spinoza's determinism does not produce the conclusion you might expect. It does not lead to nihilism or passivity. It leads somewhere much more interesting. Spinoza said the question, does my life mean something, is being asked incorrectly when it is asked in the form, did I choose correctly from a menu of genuine alternatives, because that menu never existed. The question is not whether you could have chosen differently. The question is whether you understand what you are doing and why, whether you are acting from clear understanding or from confused passion, from genuine knowledge of what makes you and your community flourish, or from reactive, anxious striving that you have never examined. Meaning, for Spinoza, is not granted from outside. It is not bestowed by God or the universe or other people's approval. It emerges from the quality of your engagement with existence. A life spent acting from clear understanding, pursuing genuine knowledge, contributing to human community, that life has meaning not because the universe approves, but because it is in itself the fullest expression of what a human being is. The man who has spent decades being productive without ever asking what the productivity is for has not necessarily wasted his life. But he is more vulnerable to the meaning crisis because he has outsourced the question of meaning to external metrics. The income, the status, the approval, the achievements. And none of those things can actually answer the question, because the question is not about achievements. The question is about whether you have been alive in the full sense while you were supposedly living. Spinoza would say, the fear that your life meant nothing is often, at its root, the recognition that you have been living at a remove from yourself, acting from social expectation rather than genuine understanding of what you value, running programs that were installed in you by fear rather than engaging authentically with existence. And the antidote is not to find some cosmic meaning imposed from outside. The antidote is to start asking the question you have been avoiding. What do I actually value? Not what do I value because other men value it, not what do I value because it signals success, but what genuinely expands my capacity to think, to feel, to engage, what actually makes me more alive? That question does not guarantee a comfortable answer, but it is the one Spinoza thought we owe ourselves. And asking it honestly, even late, even when you feel like you should have asked it decades ago, is not a failure. It is the beginning of the only kind of meaning that does not require external validation to sustain it. Fear number 3, the fear of losing control. There is a type of man, and most men recognize this type because they either are this type or grew up around this type, who is frightened by any situation where he is not the one making the decisions. Who needs to be competent in every room he enters? Who would rather attempt something alone and fail than ask for help and succeed? Who equates being in control with being safe and losing control with a kind of death? This is not just a personality quirk. It is one of the most pervasive forms that death anxiety takes in men, and it is almost never recognized as such. The logic runs like this. If I am in control, then I can prevent bad things from happening. If I can prevent bad things from happening, then I can prevent the worst thing from happening. Then I can prevent the worst thing from happening. If I can prevent the worst thing from happening. Except, of course, you cannot. The worst thing is not preventable. No level of control, competence, planning, or optimization will keep you out of the ground eventually. And at some level, the control-seeking man knows this, which is why the control-seeking never ends. There is always more to optimize, always more to prepare for. Because stopping means confronting the thing the control was designed to avoid. Spinoza would look at this pattern with something that I think could only be described as quiet compassion. Because he understood, and this is central to his entire philosophy, that the human being is not the source of itself. You did not choose to exist. You did not choose the body you inhabit, the family you were born into, the initial dispositions and emotional tendencies that shaped how you respond to the world. You arrived already in motion, already the product of an infinite chain of causes that preceded you by, quite literally, forever. This should be terrifying. And for men who have built their identity on self-sufficiency, on being the cause of their own outcomes, on never being at the mercy of anything outside their control, it is terrifying. Because if Spinoza is right, then the self-made man is a myth, not a comfortable myth, a myth that costs you your actual life. But here is what Spinoza does with this recognition, and this is where his philosophy becomes genuinely useful rather than just sobering. He distinguishes between two kinds of existence in the world. He calls them being a cause and being an effect. In modern language, we might say the difference between acting from understanding and being acted upon by forces you do not comprehend. The person who is reactive, who is driven by confused passions, by unexamined fear, by the need to avoid something they have never clearly named, that person is, in Spinoza's terms, in a kind of bondage. They are being moved by things rather than moving through clear understanding. And the paradox is that the man who is most obsessed with control is often the most deeply in bondage, because the control is itself a reaction to fear, which means fear is what is actually running the show. The truly free person, in Spinoza's philosophy, is not the one who controls everything. The truly free person is the one who understands what is happening and why, including what is happening inside themselves. Who can look at their own reactions and recognize their origins? Who knows which of their desires come from clear understanding and which come from confusion and anxiety? And who can, on the basis of that understanding, choose how to engage? Freedom for Spinoza is not about controlling outcomes. It is about understanding causes. And paradoxically, the man who accepts that he is not the ultimate cause of himself, who accepts that he is embedded in something vast and interconnected that he did not create and cannot ultimately master, often becomes more effective, not less. Because he stops wasting energy on the illusion of total control and starts engaging clearly with what is actually in front of him. The fear of losing control is, at its root, the fear of being at the mercy of a universe that does not care about your plans. Spinoza would not lie to you about whether the universe cares about your plans. It does not in the sense that you might want it to, but understanding that fact, really understanding it, not just saying it, frees you from the exhausting task of defending against it. You are already in the universe. You already are it in some sense. The war against necessity was always unwinnable, and dropping it is not surrender. It is the first genuinely free thing you have ever done. Fear number 4. The fear of being forgotten. Let us be specific about this one, because it gets confused with the fear of disappearing, and they are related but not identical. The fear of disappearing is about the self ending. The fear of being forgotten is about the self not mattering enough to be remembered. They have different emotional textures. The fear of disappearing hits you in the gut. The fear of being forgotten is quieter, more melancholic, more like grief. It is the feeling that arrives when you realize that the world will continue without noticeable disruption after you are gone, that the gap you leave will close quickly, that you will be thought of less and less by fewer and fewer people until you are simply not thought of at all. For men who are raised to believe that significance is everything, that the point of being alive is to leave a mark, to matter, to be someone, this is a specific kind of existential torture. It turns every ordinary Tuesday into a referendum on your worth. It makes legacy not a nice idea, but an urgent, desperate necessity. It explains the man who cannot stop working, cannot retire even when he has enough, cannot let go of the role that has defined him, because the role is the proof of significance, and without it there is only the question, was I actually anyone? Spinoza's own biography is, somewhat ironically, a perfect example of how confused our relationship to legacy actually is. He was excommunicated at 23. He spent the rest of his short life, he died at 44, from a lung condition, probably tuberculosis, grinding lenses to support himself and writing in near isolation. He published almost nothing under his own name during his lifetime. His major work, The Ethics, was published posthumously. By the standards of conventional significance, his life was obscure. He held no position, led no movement, commanded no army, governed nothing. He was, to most of the people alive during his lifetime, a relatively unknown man who had been cast out of his community for reasons that were never fully explained. And 350 years later, he is considered one of the most important thinkers in the history of human civilization. Philosophers call him the God-intoxicated man and the most consistent of the rationalists. Einstein was asked if he believed in God and said he believed in Spinoza's God. His influence runs through the Enlightenment, through Romanticism, through contemporary philosophy of mind. Now, Spinoza himself did not know this would happen. He could not have known. And he did not, as far as we can tell, spend his life tormented by obscurity. He spent it thinking clearly and writing carefully and living by all accounts with a kind of equanimity that impressed everyone who met him. He was described as gentle, precise, deeply kind. What is Spinoza's actual philosophical answer to the fear of being forgotten? It comes through the concept he is probably most associated with, subspecie aeternitatis. Under the aspect of eternity, Spinoza's argument is that there are two ways to understand anything, including your own life. You can understand it from the perspective of time, from the inside of history, from the particular moment you happen to inhabit. Or you can understand it, subspecie aeternitatis, from the perspective of eternity, from the viewpoint of infinite substance, from outside the temporal sequence altogether. From the temporal perspective, your life is a brief event in a very long story, and whether it is remembered or forgotten is a contingent fact, depending on circumstances largely outside your control. From the perspective of eternity, your life is a necessary expression of infinite reality at a particular point in the infinite unfolding of existence. It had to happen. It happened fully. It is in that sense permanent, not in memory, but in fact. It occurred. It was real. This is not a cheap comfort. Spinoza is not saying, do not worry about legacy because your existence is cosmically significant. He is saying something stranger and in some ways harder. The significance you are looking for when you seek to be remembered is the wrong kind of significance. You want to be significant in time. But your actual significance, the real weight and reality of your existence, is not a temporal fact. It is an eternal one. You existed. That is as real as anything that has ever been real. The fear of being forgotten is a fear about reputation, about other people's minds, about the continuation of your name. And Spinoza would ask, why is that the measure? Why is what strangers think of you after you are dead more real than what you actually were while you were alive? The man who lives fully, who engages genuinely with existence, who thinks clearly, who loves well, who contributes honestly, has not left less of a mark because fewer people know his name. He has been more fully real. And from the perspective of eternity, that is not less. That is the whole thing. Fear number 5. The fear that nobody really loved you. This is the one men are least likely to admit, and it is, I think, one of the deepest. The fear, arriving most powerfully near the end, that the life you lived, the relationships you maintained, the people who said they loved you, was conducted at a remove. That you were never really known. That what people loved was a version of you, a performance of you, a useful or functional or impressive version, but not actually you. Because for many men, that is all they made available. The real self, the frightened, uncertain, tender, wondering self, stayed locked away behind competence and capability and the performance of strength. And the tragic irony is that the very thing that was supposed to keep you safe, the armor of self-sufficiency, the refusal to be vulnerable, the commitment to never needing anything from anyone, is the thing that kept you alone. Spinoza has a concept for this that he develops in Part 4 of the Ethics, where he talks about what he calls human bondage. Human bondage, for Spinoza, is not slavery in the conventional sense. It is the condition of being controlled by passive emotions, emotions that arise in you as responses to external things, emotions that you experience but do not understand, emotions that move you without your comprehension or consent. And one of the deepest forms of bondage in his framework is the emotional isolation that comes from not understanding your own inner life. The man who has been told, from earliest childhood, that emotions are weakness, that vulnerability is dangerous, that needing others is a kind of failure, that man does not stop having emotions, he just stops understanding them. They go underground, they express themselves sideways, through control, through anger, through work, through the body. And he also stops being able to receive love clearly. Because love, real intimacy, real being known, requires showing the parts of yourself you most want to hide, the parts that are uncertain and afraid and not yet figured out, the parts that contradict the competent image. And if those parts never get shown, then the love that arrives in response to the competent image is real, but it is not the thing you actually needed. You wanted to be known. You received approval for your performance. And you learned to call that love and wonder why it never felt like enough. Spinoza would say that the liberation from this particular form of bondage is, as always, a matter of understanding. Understanding what you actually feel. Understanding where those feelings come from. Understanding the difference between the social self you have been trained to present and the actual being underneath it. Not so that you can perform vulnerability as a new kind of strategy, but so that you can genuinely encounter yourself and, in doing so, become actually available to be encountered by others. This is one of the places where Spinoza's philosophy intersects most powerfully with what modern attachment theory and trauma research have been discovering independently. The capacity for intimacy, for being genuinely known and genuinely loving, depends on a kind of self-knowledge that many men are systematically denied by the cultures that shape them. The man who cannot be vulnerable is not just managing his relationship to others, he is managing, poorly, expensively, his relationship to himself. And the death dimension of this fear is specific. The terror that arrives near the end of a life is not just about what you failed to do out in the world. It is about what you failed to allow in, the love that was offered and deflected, the moments of potential intimacy that were converted into efficiency, the people who wanted to know you and were met every time with the performance rather than the person. Spinoza does not offer a guarantee that it is not too late to address this, but his entire philosophy is oriented toward the proposition that understanding is available to you whenever you genuinely seek it. The door to genuine self-knowledge is not locked by age or history. It is locked only by the decision, the fear-driven, understandable, ultimately costly decision to keep not looking. Fear number 6. The fear of nothingness. We need to slow down here because this fear is often confused with others, and it is worth being precise about it. The fear of nothingness is not quite the fear of dying. Dying can be painful or peaceful, quick or slow. The fear of dying is a fear of the process. The fear of nothingness is a fear of the state of not existing at all. The complete and permanent absence of experience. The fact that there will not even be a you to experience the absence. It is the thing that Thomas Nagel was pointing at when he wrote that death seems bad from the outside, but cannot be bad from the inside, because there is no inside. And somehow that logical observation does not make it less terrifying. If anything, it makes it more terrifying. Because what the intellect knows and what the gut feels are, in this case, very different things. The gut feels that nothingness is bad for the person who experiences it. The intellect says there is no person to experience it. And this gap, this inability to make peace with non-existence, even when you understand logically that it is not a suffering state, is one of the most persistent and uncomfortable features of being a mortal creature with self-awareness. Spinoza's response to this fear comes from his pantheism, and it requires sitting with for a moment. Spinoza's universe is not a collection of separate things that come together and then fall apart. It is one infinite substance, expressing itself in infinite ways, of which every particular thing, every particle, every organism, every human being is a finite mode, a temporary configuration of infinite substance. When a particular configuration ends, when the pattern that is you ceases to hold, the substance does not go anywhere. There is nowhere for it to go. It is infinite and all-inclusive. It does not reduce or diminish. The matter and energy that constituted your body returns to the larger system. The pattern dissolves back into the substrate from which it briefly emerged. You are not, in Spinoza's universe, visiting from somewhere else and then returning to that somewhere else when you die. You are already the universe, experiencing itself in a particular form, and when the form ends, the universe continues. You continue, not as a personal self, not as a remembered identity, not as a soul in any conventional sense, but as part of the continuing whole. This is different from the religious consolations most people know. It does not promise personal continuity. It does not promise that you will be reunited with people you love. It does not promise anything warm or personal at all, and yet it is not nothing either. It is the recognition that the nothingness you fear, the complete annihilation of the thing that matters, may be based on an overly rigid conception of what you are. If you are a temporary configuration of infinite substance, then you ending is less like a thing being destroyed and more like a wave returning to the ocean. The wave was real. The wave mattered. The wave was genuinely distinct from the other waves around it, and then it was not a wave anymore, and the ocean continued. Spinoza does not pretend this is comfortable. He does not dress it up. But he does insist that the terror of nothingness is partly a consequence of excessive attachment to a particular conception of selfhood. The conception that this specific configuration is the only real you, and that its end is therefore the end of everything that matters. If you loosen that identification, not all at once, not by performing detachment, but slowly, through genuine philosophical engagement, the terror does not disappear, but it changes quality. It becomes more like sadness. And sadness, unlike terror, can be sat with, can be felt, can even, in the right conditions, deepen your appreciation of what is present right now. The fear of nothingness is most powerful in the man who has been gripping his selfhood most tightly. And the practice Spinoza implicitly recommends of understanding yourself as part of something larger, of experiencing the world subspecie aeternitatis, is not a cognitive trick. It is a genuine shift in the felt sense of what you are. And it is available. It takes time and it takes real engagement, but it is available. Fear number 7. The fear of dying unlived. This is perhaps the most quietly devastating fear of all, and it is the one that Spinoza's ethics addresses most directly. The fear of dying unlived is not the fear of death itself. It is the fear of arriving at the end of your life and discovering that you were not fully present for most of it, that you were managing and optimizing and strategizing and performing and planning, while the actual life, the thing itself, the texture and color and feeling of being alive, was passing without your full participation. It is the fear that Thoreau was naming when he wrote about going to the woods to not discover at the hour of death that he had not lived. It is the fear underneath every midlife crisis. It is the question that arrives when the children leave home, when the career peaks, when the achievement that was supposed to make you happy makes you temporarily happy and then leaves you where it found you. The man who lives this fear most acutely is often, paradoxically, the man who has been most successful by conventional measures, because conventional success does not require full presence. It requires work ethic and discipline and strategic thinking and emotional management. It rewards productivity and punishes daydreaming. It tells you that enjoyment is something you earn through sufficient suffering, and that the suffering is the point rather than the enjoyment. Spinoza's ethics is, among many other things, a sustained argument against this conception of the good life. He was not an ascetic. He was not arguing that pleasure is suspicious or that suffering is virtuous. He was arguing for something he called beatitudo, often translated as blessedness, though flourishing might capture it better, which is the state of a human being who is operating at the fullest expression of their nature. For Spinoza, you are most alive when you are most active in the precise sense he gives that word, when you are acting from your own nature, your own understanding, your own most genuine self, rather than being acted upon by external forces and internal confusion. When your thinking is clear, when your relationships are real rather than strategic, when your engagement with the world comes from genuine interest and love rather than fear and obligation. The Ethics was not written as a self-help manual. Spinoza did not set out to make you feel better. He set out to think clearly about what human beings are and what living well actually means. But the conclusions he reaches are, in their own austere way, deeply generous. He does not demand heroism. He does not require that you transcend your humanity. He says, your nature is good. Your desire to know and to love and to engage is not a problem to be solved. It is the thing itself. Honor it. The fear of dying unlived is the recognition that you have been honoring something else instead. You have been honoring the idea of yourself, the performance, the achievement, the reputation, at the expense of the actual experience of being you. And the recognition of this, as terrifying as it is also the beginning of the correction. Because the year you start asking, honestly, what would make you actually feel alive, not successful, not impressive, not secure, but alive, that year is not wasted, even if it comes late, even if it comes decades after you wish it had come. The question itself is the reorientation. And Spinoza, who spent his most productive years grinding lenses in a small room and thinking enormous thoughts, would tell you that the fullness of a life is not a function of its external dimensions. It is a function of the quality of your engagement while you were in it. The Spinozist antidote. Thinking under eternity. Now that we have named the fears, all 7 of them in their specific and different shapes, we can talk about what Spinoza actually prescribes. Not in the generic philosophical sense of cultivate wisdom, but in the concrete sense of what this man's system of thought actually offers someone who is genuinely wrestling with mortality. The central practice Spinoza recommends is what he calls the intellectual love of God, and we need to unpack that phrase carefully because it sounds mystical in a way that can make people dismiss it, and the dismissal would be a mistake. The intellectual love of God, amor intellectualis Deus, is not a religious practice in the conventional sense. It does not require worship or prayer or belief in a personal deity. Remember that Spinoza's God is not a person. Spinoza's God is the whole of existence, infinite substance, the universe itself, understood in its full reality. So the intellectual love of God is, in concrete terms, the love that arises from understanding the nature of existence clearly. This is Spinoza's account of the highest human experience. When you understand how things actually work, when you grasp, not just abstractly but with felt comprehension, how everything is connected, how you are part of an infinite whole, how the causes of things follow necessarily from the nature of reality, you experience something, not just intellectual satisfaction, something more like what mystics call union, or contemplatives call peace. The specific emotional tone that arises from clear understanding of what is. And this, for Spinoza, is the antidote to death anxiety. Not because it makes you immortal, not because it promises anything after death, but because it fundamentally changes the relationship between your particular self and the infinite whole of which you are a part. The man who is terrified of death is, at some level, a man who feels profoundly separate from everything around him. Separate, alone, and therefore desperately in need of persistence as the only hedge against annihilation. The man who has achieved genuine subspecie aeternitatis thinking, who experiences himself as a genuine and necessary part of an infinite whole, is less desperate for the persistence of this particular form, because this particular form is not where all the reality is anymore. Let me be clear about what I am not saying. I am not saying that the philosophical man does not care about death. I am not saying that Spinoza's understanding produces some kind of serene detachment in which nothing matters. That would be its own kind of pathology. Spinoza cared enormously about his work. He cared about the people around him. He was, by all accounts, genuinely and warmly engaged with life. He was not performing non-attachment. He was present. The difference is that his presence was not powered by terror. He was not engaging with life frantically as a defense against the abyss. He was engaging with it because engagement is the natural activity of a human being who understands what a human being is. Clear, active, genuinely interested engagement. Not despite the fact of mortality, but without being permanently derailed by it. This is the difference between suppressing death anxiety and transcending it. Suppression looks like hyperactivity, like control obsession, like the inability to slow down and feel. Transcendence looks like genuine presence. Presence that is possible precisely because you have looked at the thing that terrifies you and understood it clearly enough that it no longer has the power to run your life from behind the curtain. The concrete path to this, for Spinoza, involves several interlocking practices. The first is genuine self-knowledge, not the Instagram kind of know yourself, but the hard kind, understanding which of your emotions come from clear perception and which come from confused reaction. Understanding what you actually value versus what you have been taught to value. Understanding the difference between the fear that is informing your life and the understanding that could replace it. The second is the expansion of the intellect through genuine inquiry, reading, thinking, engaging with ideas that challenge your existing frameworks. Spinoza believed that the more clearly you understand the nature of reality, the more your emotions naturally align with that understanding. You do not have to force yourself to feel less afraid of death through willpower. You come to feel less afraid as a natural consequence of understanding more clearly what you are. The third is the cultivation of genuine community, relationships based on shared rational engagement rather than mutual utility. Spinoza was not a solitary misanthrope. He maintained deep correspondence and genuine friendship with a number of people throughout his life. He understood that human beings flourish in connection, that the isolated self is a diminished self, and that the intellectual love of God, the experience of understanding reality clearly, is deepened rather than diluted by genuine human encounter. And the fourth, perhaps the most practically important, is the practice of subspecie aeternitatis itself. Deliberately shifting perspective. Not as a permanent residence, not as a way of avoiding the temporal reality of your life, but as a regular exercise in perspective-taking. Asking yourself, from time to time, how does this look from outside time? How does my particular fear, my particular ambition, my particular anxiety appear when I zoom all the way out? Not to dismiss it, your specific life is real and important, but to see it in its full context, which is always larger than the moment feels. This practice does not require meditation cushions or philosophical training, though those can help. It requires only the genuine willingness to see, to look at your life from further back than you usually do, to notice what actually matters when the noise of social approval and status-seeking and mortality management quiets down enough for the real things to become visible. The conversation men never have, let us talk about something that is not Spinoza exactly, but that Spinoza's work makes possible. Men do not talk to each other about death. Not really. They will joke about it. They will talk about it impersonally. Someone else's death, death in the abstract, death as data. But the actual conversation, I am afraid of dying. I am afraid I have wasted my life. I am afraid no one really knows me. I am afraid the whole thing is meaningless. That conversation almost never happens between men, and the cost of that silence is not trivial. There is research suggesting that men who lack genuine social support, who do not have relationships in which they can be honestly seen, have significantly worse physical and mental health outcomes. The famous Harvard study of adult development, the longest study of human well-being ever conducted, found that the quality of relationships was the single strongest predictor of happy aging and late life flourishing. Not achievement, not income, not fame. The quality of relationships, and quality of relationships requires honesty. It requires the willingness to be actually known, which requires the willingness to actually show yourself, which requires the willingness to be vulnerable, which requires, in the culture most men have been raised in, a kind of courage that nobody taught them to exercise. Spinoza would frame this differently. He would not call it vulnerability in the therapeutic sense. He would call it the movement from confusion to clarity. The man who hides his fears from others is also, necessarily, hiding them from himself, because genuine self-knowledge is relational. It deepens in encounter with others who are also genuinely engaged. The man who performs strength without variation never gets the feedback that might help him understand himself more clearly. He stays locked in his own closed system. The conversation about death, the real one, is not a therapy session. It does not have to be emotional in the conventional sense. It can be a conversation between two men at a kitchen table, or on a long drive, or after a funeral when the proximity of death has briefly unlocked something. Are you afraid of dying? Sometimes. Are you? Yeah. And then actually talking about it, not resolving it, not fixing it, just looking at it together, which changes its quality completely. That is, in its own modest way, a Spinozist act. It is the movement toward clear seeing, toward genuine human encounter, toward the kind of connection that does not require either man to perform a version of himself that he is not. What Spinoza would say to you. Specifically, if Spinoza could sit with you specifically, wherever you are in your life, what would he say? He would not comfort you with lies. That is the first thing to understand. He was famously, almost rudely, committed to honesty. He would not tell you that everything happens for a reason, that God has a plan for you, that your suffering is building towards something beautiful. He did not believe those things, and he would not say them just to make you feel better, because he thought that false comfort was ultimately more harmful than useful truth. He would say, "You are afraid," and the fear is understandable. You are a finite being who knows about your own finitude, and that knowledge produces a specific kind of discomfort that you have probably been managing rather than addressing for a very long time. The management has cost you. It has cost you presence. It has cost you intimacy. It has cost you the genuine engagement with your own life that would have made that life feel like yours. He would say, the fear does not make you weak. The conatus, the drive to persist, is the essence of what you are. Of course you do not want to die. Of course the prospect of non-existence disturbs you. This is not a character flaw. It is the fundamental nature of a living being with self-awareness. Stop being ashamed of it. He would say the solution to the fear is not to become braver about death. It is to understand more clearly what you are. You are not only this bounded individual self. You are a mode of infinite substance, a necessary expression of everything that exists, connected to the whole in ways that the fearful ego cannot perceive, but that genuine understanding can begin to reveal. The more clearly you understand this, not as a pleasant idea, but as a felt reality, the less the fear rules you. Not because death becomes unimportant, but because the self that was so terrified of death was never quite as separate, never quite as alone, never quite as easily annihilated as it feared. He would say, live, not as a performance, not as a strategy, not as a competition or a legacy-building project or a defense against obscurity. Live in the sense of genuinely engaging with what is in front of you, with the people who are with you, with the work that genuinely interests you, with the natural world you are part of, with the large questions that keep returning because they are worth returning to. This engagement is not preparation for a better future. It is the thing itself. It is what it means to be a human being who's actually alive rather than just occupied. He would say, it is not too late. Whatever age you are, whatever you have and have not done with your years, genuine understanding is available to you right now. The door to clear seeing is open. The question is whether you are willing to walk through it. And he would say, with the quiet certainty of a man who spent his life thinking through hard things and finding that hard things, when understood clearly, reveal something unexpectedly beautiful. The universe is not indifferent to you in the way you fear. It does not care about you in the way you might want. It does not have preferences. It is not watching out for you. It does not guarantee your comfort or your significance, but you are of it. You are genuinely, completely, inescapably of it. And that is not the same as being alone. It is the opposite of being alone. It is just a form of belonging that requires more understanding than comfort to fully feel. The bravest thing most men will ever do is not physical. It is not stoic endurance. It is not working yourself to exhaustion without complaint. It is not refusing to cry at a funeral. It is not any of the things that get coded as bravery in the cultures that shaped us. The bravest thing is to look honestly at your own fear of death, to stop managing it and start understanding it, to ask without flinching what the fear is actually about, what specific losses it is mourning in advance, what unlived life it is pointing toward, what genuine needs it has been encoding in the language of productivity and achievement and legacy. And then, having looked at it clearly, to let it inform you rather than control you, to let the knowledge of your mortality sharpen your presence, to let the fear of dying unlived motivate you not toward more frantic achievement, but toward more genuine engagement, to let the terror of nothingness loosen just slightly as you begin to understand yourself as something more continuous with existence than the anxious ego usually allows. Spinoza did this. He looked at everything, God, nature, human emotion, death, freedom, with a clarity that was brave precisely because it refused comfort. He did not flinch from what the universe actually is. And what he found on the other side of that unflinching examination was not despair. It was something he called beatitudo, blessedness, a kind of deep, quiet joy that is not dependent on circumstances, not threatened by misfortune, not even particularly threatened by death. Because it is rooted not in the persistence of a particular self, but in the genuine engagement with reality that happens while the self persists. He wrote, "A free man thinks of nothing less than of death, and his wisdom is a meditation not on death, but on life." That line is often quoted as if it means, do not think about death, think about life instead, as if it is an instruction to avoid the question. But that is not what he means. The free man, the man who understands clearly, who has looked at his own nature and the nature of existence without flinching, does not spend his mental energy managing death terror precisely because he has already understood it. He has looked at it, he has thought it through, and having done so, he is released from the obligation of defending against it at every moment. His wisdom becomes a meditation on life not because death is unimportant, but because death, properly understood, is not separate from life. It is the other face of the same coin. The finitude of your existence is what makes your particular existence specific, irreplaceable, genuinely yours. You are not infinite, you are this. This specific, temporary, necessary expression of infinite reality, here for a limited and unknowable time. And the question, the only real question, is what you're going to do with that time. Not how you are going to make it count. Not how you're going to be remembered, not how you are going to control enough to feel safe, but how you're going to actually be in it, how present you are going to be for the specific, irrepeatable fact of your own existence. Spinoza spent his 44 years thinking enormous thoughts in a small room, and by all evidence, he was genuinely present for it. He was not managing his life from behind a glass wall of avoidance and performance. He was in it, fully, carefully, with all the intelligence and care he had. You have years, he did not. The question is just what you are going to do with them. The conversation most men are afraid to have, about death, about fear, about what they actually want from their lives, is available to you right now, not eventually, not when you have sorted everything out. Now. Spinoza would say, start there. Start with the honest acknowledgement of the thing you've been carrying alone. Start with the willingness to see clearly rather than comfortably. Start with the recognition that the fear does not make you weak, and the examination of the fear does not make you morbid. It makes you, for perhaps the first time, genuinely free. That is the invitation. That is what 350 years of quiet influence has been building toward. Not a system to follow or a doctrine to adopt, but a way of looking at yourself, at death, at the whole strange fact of being alive, that is honest enough to hurt and clear enough to heal. The bravest thing is to look. So look. So look.